Hello and welcome to this very special mini masterclass on scenario modeling in Excel. So I am Danielle Stein Fairhurst. I am a financial modeling specialist. So financial modeling is what I live and breathe. It's pretty much all I've ever done. I have written a couple of books about financial modeling. So this using Excel for business and financial modeling, and also financial modeling in Excel for dummies. So all of those books you see behind you are all copies of those, and I'm going to be referring to a couple of parts of those books as we go throughout today. So what I'd like to cover with you today is all about scenario modeling in Excel, because a really big part of financial modeling, in fact, the whole point of putting together a financial model is so that you can run scenario analysis on that. And I know there's lots and lots of fancy pieces of software that will do it for us, but to my mind, there is nothing better than just putting together your financial model in Excel and then being able to run sensitivities or scenario analysis or what if analysis straight off the top, over the top of the financial model that you've built. And particularly in the current environment with so much uncertainty out there, being able to forecast the future, being able to see what's coming around the corner. I mean, we really don't know whether what we have predicted or what we have forecasted as part of our financial model, whether or not it's accurate. Well, in fact, I'm pretty sure we know that it's not accurate, but being able to tweak the inputs and make those changes over the top of your financial model is just going to make your model far more useful. And it means that we're going to have a much better idea of what the possible outcomes are in the future. So what I would like to do with you today is to cover three topics. Firstly, we'll talk a little bit about scenarios and sensitivities. Then I'd like to cover all of the different technical methods in Excel, so the ways that you can put together a scenario or a sensitivity analysis in Excel. And then I'd also like to demonstrate how to do that. And then we'll take a look at those couple of different methods and look at some advantages and disadvantages of each method. So by the end of the session, you should have a bit of an idea of all of the different types of scenarios and sensitivities tools that you can use in standard Excel in your financial models. Okay, so here goes. The first thing I'd like to talk about is looking at the different, we kind of use these interchangeably a little bit, sensitivities, whether it's scenarios, whether it's sensitivities. But before I talk about that, let's talk about what financial modeling actually is. Now, when I run these sessions live, we often, put a bit of a poll out about what people think financial models are, and a bit of a hint, it's got nothing to do with fashion. It's got nothing to do with catwalks. It is according to I put this in the dummies book. Is my definition of a financial model is that it's a tool or a structure that's it's usually built in Excel, that that displays possible solutions to a real world financial problem. So you've got a problem, you want to know, you have a question that you need answered or a problem that you need solved. So how much profit are we going to make next month? Or should I go ahead with this project? Or should we purchase this asset? Something like that. And the financial model will predict or put together a structure to predict or to show what possible solutions or what the possible outcomes are of that problem. And a financial model that's well built, you'll really be able to run sensitivities and scenarios over the top of that. But first of all, we need to consider whether it's a spreadsheet or whether it's a financial model. And there's a bit of they're really not the same thing. A spreadsheet could be just about anything. A spreadsheet could just be a list of telephone numbers. It could be data. It could be basically any kind of information that's structured in Excel. That's a spreadsheet, but a financial model is more structured. It has inputs, it has assumptions, it has outputs, calculations, and scenarios. A financial model is more dynamic. So really, you can't really call it a financial model unless you have inputs and you have outputs. So having you change the inputs and the outputs change. I mean, that's really the whole point of a financial model. And a financial model uses relationships between the variables. So changing any of those inputs will change the output. And lastly, it does contain hypothetical outcomes. So instead of just having historical information of a report of saying this is what happened last month, a financial model would enable you to be able to say, what would happen if we did this, or what would happen if we did that? That's really the point of a financial model. And what I often see is that people finish their financial model in Excel and they save a copy of it and they call it best case scenario, and then they change all the numbers and they save it again as worst case scenario, and then they change all the numbers and then they save it again as base case scenario, and I mean, that's okay, but it's not the most effective way of doing it. So what we're going to do today is look at a couple of different tools and techniques and ways that we can do that. So the differences between a sensitivity and a scenario. A sensitivity is really where we tweak one or two input variables. So what would happen if we change this? What would happen if we change that? Oh, that's interesting. What would happen if we change that? Oh, I didn't realize that would happen. So that's the idea of a sensitivity. Wanting to know how sensitive the model is to changes in input variables. A scenario, on the other hand, is when you are changing a large number of inputs. If there's some interdependencies, so if this goes up, this goes down, this stays the same. So having a whole raft of events that possibly could change as a result of the changes in the input. So that's kind of the difference between sensitivities and scenario analysis. So sensitivities is just where you're changing one or two input variables. Scenarios is when you have a large number of inputs with different interdependencies. What if analysis is, it could be either. Typically in Excel, we refer to what if analysis as a goal seek perhaps, but really it could be either. It's, changing what would happen if we change this, what would happen if we change that. So moving on to the next section now, I'd like to talk to you about some of the technical methods of scenario analysis in Excel. Now, we all know that Excel is the most fantastic tool. And to my mind, I really don't think that you can go much further than using Excel for putting together some scenario analysis. And I'll show you a couple of different methods of doing that. So the different technical tools that I'd like to cover with you, there's basically 5 different tools just in standard Excel. I mean, I'm not talking about any add-ins or anything extra, anything fancy. This is just what Excel has straight out of the box. 5, no less than 5 different methods of scenario analysis, scenario tools. So firstly, we'll talk about manual scenario selection, and that is by far the most common method of scenario selection. That could be either a drop-down, a combo drop-down, data validation drop-down, so some kind of manual or some sort of switches where you're manually changing the scenario and then all the numbers change. We'll also take a look at what Excel calls Scenario Manager. I'm not a huge fan, but I'll show you what it looks like anyway. Then we'll take a look at data tables. Data tables are great. Those are a tool in Excel. They're pretty tricky. We'll then take a look at a goal seek. So, where you're looking at the input and the output and changing the input to get a certain goal. And then lastly, we'll take a look at Monte Carlo simulations. So those are pretty tricky and quite difficult to do in Excel, but we'll take a look at how you can actually apply that in Excel. Okay, let's have a look at Excel now. So I am going to jump over into Excel and I'll give you a copy of this file. So I'll put a link so that you can access this. So this example comes from the Financial Modelling in Excel for Dummies, and we've got really, really simple project calculations. And what we want to do here is to say whether or not it includes tax. So we just do a drop down, yes or no. So that's just a really simple data validation drop down box. And the way that we build a data validation drop down box is just on the data tab. We go into data validation, and in this case, we just put a, normally you would have any value. And in this case, we say allow a list, and the source is either yes or no. So just a really, really simple data validation drop-down box that you could apply different scenarios to. So the next one we'll take a look at is a combo box. So this is a little object that sits over the top of the sheet. It is done using the developer tab. So you need to have the developer tab in the ribbon in order to be able to apply a combo box. To do that, you just need to go into more commands, customize ribbon, and just allow the developer. So you just need to tick that box that says developer, and then you'll have access to the developer tab. Now there's more instructions in this book. On page 329, it shows you how to actually apply the developer, how to build a little drop-down box that looks like that. But basically, you just need to draw it. So you just insert and then you draw it. You can assign macros if you wanted to. We're not going to do that right now. Go to Format Control, and the input range will be best case, base case, worst case. And the cell link will be an output. So you can give it any. In this case, I've chosen F3, so you can choose any output you like. So if I choose best case, it changes to number 1 because best case is the first option. If I change it to base case, it'll change it to number 2. If I change it to worst case, of course, it'll change it to number 3. So if I wanted to pick up the price there based on the drop down, I would have to use a formula such as maybe a choose, or I could just go with an index, something like that, that would say, that's my range, and then you would choose with an index, could be the row number or the column number. In this case, I'm going to choose the row number, which is a 3, and that's picking up the range there, but I actually wanted to pick up the price. There we go. So I can just move that across, and that picks up the price based on whichever option you have selected. So if I say best case, it changes. Base case, it changes just like that. So those are just a couple of different methods. So that's the difference between using a data validation dropdown or a combo dropdown. So either of those are pretty good options for creating a manual scenario selection. So you change the dropdown and everything in the model flows throughout. So just going over to the next example. If I just go, yes, let's have a look at the scenario manager. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this because I'm not a big fan of scenario manager. But if we go into here, go under what if analysis, we've got goal seek, which is really cool, which we'll have a look at. We've got data tables, which are really cool. And yeah, you've got scenario manager, which is not that great. But here we've got an example where we've got income, mortgage, bills, travel, and savings there. So obviously you can tell by the way that I formatted this that you can change this one or you could change this one. So if I go into what if analysis and run my scenario manager, I could say show the best case scenario, I could show my base case scenario, or I could show my worst case scenario. There we go. That's it. That's not particularly impressive. Of course, you can do a little summary there. You could say show, the best case, the base case, and the worst case side by side. To me, a data table actually does a better job of that. But, I think some people like to use the scenario manager. Excel has called it scenario manager, which sounds pretty cool. So I just thought I'd show you what that looks like. Okay. On to data tables next. Now, data tables are definitely worth the effort. So instead of having where you are going one at a time, with a data table, what we do is we can actually see all of our outputs simultaneously. So rather than going drop down, all the numbers change, drop down, all the numbers change, we can see all of the outputs side by side, which is really, really cool. So there is some instructions on how to do this exact example in this book on page 333, and I'm going to take you through it now. So we've got something set up here. So we've got a monthly repayment calculation that's been set up, and I've used the PMT. You can have a look, and I think the book takes you through exactly how to calculate that. I'm not going to go into that much detail right now. What I want to show you is how to do sensitivities. So, and this is purely a sensitivity analysis, not really a scenario analysis. You know, we talked about the difference between sensitivities and scenario analysis. So this is definitely a sensitivity. So with the interest rate of 7.5%, wow, that's a lot. That would be my monthly repayment. But if I change that to 6%, oh, okay. If I change it to 6.5, if I change it to 7, so you can see, you can actually see it change as you go through. Whereas with a data table, you can see all of the possible outcomes side by side. So let's have a look at that. So we go equals, of course, you have to link to there. Don't ask me why, it doesn't work if you don't. So highlight the whole lot, go to what if analysis, and we'll go to data table. Now, this is probably the trickiest part because it's going to ask you for the row input cell and the column input cell. So in this case, we want the column input cell because the inputs that are in my data table are all in a column. So the column input cell here, what it's asking you is to replace, where is the original input of the cell that you want to replace in the column? So that is the interest rate there. And we say, okay, there we go. So what it's done here is it's taken the original input that you gave it and said, what if it was 6%? What if it was 6.5%? What if it was 7%? So it shows it all in one single table. So I'll go through that again just in case you missed it. I know it's really quickly. So you need to highlight, because it's an array formula, you need to highlight the whole lot. It won't work if you tried to delete one of the cells individually, it won't work. So you need to highlight the whole lot like that. You need to link that here. So I'll give you a copy of this so you can try it out for yourself. Give it a go. So link that through there. Highlight, that's an important step. You do need to highlight the whole lot. It doesn't work if you don't. Go to data table and column input cell 7.5%. Boom, there we go. So that is a one variable data table. So what we'll do next is go into a two variable data table. So this time we're going to take a look at the term of the loan, and we'll also take a look at the interest rate. So again, we need to link that through to the corner, highlight the whole lot like that, Control Shift right arrow, Control Shift down, go into what if analysis, data table, and this time we need to put in the row input cell. So it's asking you, where is the original input for the row and where is the original input for the column? So the row is going to be the term of the loan, which is that one there. The column is going to be the interest rate. There we go. Boom. All right, so that's giving you all of the possible outcomes based on the term of the loan changing and the interest changing. There we go. So again, you can't change individually. If you want to get rid of the whole lot, you need to highlight the whole thing. I always think these look really nice if we add a bit of conditional formatting. So if I go in and maybe add in some color scales, something like that, and then you can go in, manage rules, and you can go in and edit the rule, and you can change it to something that perhaps fits your color scheme a little better. Something like, there we go. All right, something that looks, maybe something like that. Okay, so that was data tables. So they're pretty cool, hey? So let's jump in now to the goal seek, which will be next. So let's jump back into Excel. And we are back at this particular example, which is that very simple, going back to that dummies example where we were having a look at the project days. And it is just a very, very simple model. We've got our calculations working here, and that is our output. So we know that if something were to change here, that will affect the output. If something were to change here, that will affect the output. So what we want to do here is to say, let's say we know that we've got a certain budget of, we need to reduce our expenses to say $130,000, and we need to reduce the number of days so that that number there is $130,000. So I can change that to 50. Okay, that's not enough. I need to change it to 55. Okay, that's too much. So going back to the way I was, if I go to a what if analysis and then go to goal seek, I can set that cell there to 130,000 by changing the number of project days. And that will work through every possible iteration and give me exactly the number of days that we need to work in order to achieve a cost of $130,000. Now, of course, that will give me a whole lot of decimal places, so you might want to change that. But that is another really good method of sensitivity analysis, or what if analysis in Excel. When you set up your financial model, you want to be able to set it up so that you can just run a scenario analysis over the top, perhaps using a goal seek. Okay, so that was data tables, that was goal seek. All right, let's jump into Monte Carlo, or stochastic simulations. Before we do that, let's talk about why Monte Carlo simulation is useful by taking a look at the advantages and disadvantages of the methods that we've discussed so far. So thinking back to the manual scenario analysis that we talked about, where you do a drop-down box, so you'd say base case scenario, all the numbers change, best case scenario, all the numbers change. Now, the advantage of doing it like that is that it's really easy to build, it's really easy to understand, and it can handle a large number of inputs and outputs, which is great. But the problem with that is that you can only look at one scenario at a time, which makes it really hard to compare side by side. So when you change the drop down, you're looking at the whole lot of the output, but then you can't see what it was when you looked at the best case, and you can't see what it was with the worst case. So in order to look at them side by side, you'd need to create a macro button, perhaps, that was going to run through all the different scenarios, or you'd use a data table. So with a data table, like we talked about, you would be able to see all the possible inputs as they change and see how that is going to affect your financial model. So the advantages of a data table is that you can look at multiple outcomes simultaneously, which is great, which is really, really good for scenario analysis. But it is quite tricky. So if you're fairly new to Excel or new to financial modeling, it can be quite tricky for beginners to build using data tables, or even for others to understand and to take apart your model. The inputs and the outputs do need to be on the same page. You can have all of your calculations working right throughout the model, but the inputs and the outputs do need to be together. But the real disadvantage, and I might just go back to the Excel just to demonstrate, is that you can only look at one or two inputs like that. It is quite difficult to look at a range of inputs and outputs. So that is a range of variables. So that's one big disadvantage there. So if you want to look at more than one variable, you have to do multiple data tables in your model, which can get a little bit unwieldy, and it can slow down your calculation. So if you are going to be using a lot of data tables in your model, I would recommend that you go into your options in Excel, go into the formulas and just change it to automatic except for data tables. So that is going to stop your model from getting really, really slow if you have tons and tons of data tables in your calculations. So what I'd like to talk about now is some of the real disadvantages or some of the real shortcomings of scenario analysis. Is that, it's the problem, I suppose, with scenario analysis is that there can only be one outcome, and you know that that outcome will be wrong. So the model is not reality. A financial model is something that it's a structure that we build based on the inputs. So you change the inputs and the outputs change. So you know for sure that the model will be wrong. So if I were to say that I know absolutely for sure what the output of the financial model will be, I will be talking absolute rubbish. So, and I think this can be quite a common problem in financial models. We think that we know, we put down exactly the amount of what our valuation might be, down to the exact decimal place, and we have got really no idea. Now, that is really just an estimate. So this is the problem with building financial models and with using scenario analysis. It really is just a snapshot view. We know that the model is going to be wrong. So does that make it meaningless? No, definitely doesn't. But we often say a base case, and we will assign probability to that base case. And we often think that the base case is the likely case, or the middle road, or the thing that we think is most likely to happen. And that's not necessarily the case. It does often come down to the personality of the assumption maker. I know that some people putting together the models will be really, really optimistic, and they think everything's going to be going really, really well. And yeah, some people are perhaps not so optimistic. It really depends on the personality, and scenarios and sensitivities are always going to be bottom up. So it's really just, in this case, the way that we are building them in the financial model, it's based on the drivers. So you change those inputs of your financial model. If you change those inputs, then the output is going to change. And that is really the skill and the beautiful thing about financial modeling, is being able to build it in such a way, when you make those changes, the outputs will automatically will automatically change as well. This idea of putting together a best case, base case, worst case, I know it's a typical way of doing it. It's helpful. I think really the whole point of building a best case, worst case scenario is to see what is the worst case, or what's the worst that can happen, or what's the best that can happen. It can really help you prepare for the worst, or it can see, you know, what are the possible outcomes. So what I'd like to talk about now is to jump into some Monte Carlo or some stochastic simulations. And to do that, we need to just cover a little bit of statistics. First of all, are you ready for a little bit of statistics? We're just going to do a little bit of a recap on the whole idea of distributions and standard deviations, because we need to use these when we put together a Monte Carlo. So I'm going to just do it in a really, really simplistic way using Excel, of course. So remembering back to maths class, a normal distribution looks something like this. The mean is the midpoint, and if it is shaped in a normal distribution, you can see that something like 68% of the results will fall within one standard deviation of the mean. So the higher the standard deviation, the more volatile the data is. So if you have a series of cash flows that is very volatile, like in this case, investment 2, that will have a very high standard deviation, because the variation from the mean will be much higher. So just going back to the normal distribution there, if I were to ask you a question, if I were to say, if a light bulb were to last on average, remember the average is the midpoint on that normal distribution, if it lasts on average 300 days and there was a standard deviation of 65 given a normal distribution on each side, what is the probability that the light bulb you install today will last at least a year? So let's have a look at that graphically, just to get our heads around the whole concept of standard deviations and normal distributions once again. So let's say if that were 300, so that's your midpoint there, and 365 a year is 1 standard deviation away from the mean. That means if I were to add up the rest of all, the probability means that there is a 15.8% probability that the light bulb will last more than 1 year. So this is some ways that we can use probabilities and normal distributions to do some calculations based on, and we can apply this in our financial model. So let me show you what I mean. But before we do that, we do need to we do need a couple of things. We do need some historical data. We need to build our model. We need to come up with a statistical distribution. So there's a couple of different distribution you can use. I'm going to talk about a normal distribution in this case because it's easier. So you need to know the mean, you need to know the distribution, and you need to know what that standard deviation is. So we are going to, now that we know all of these things, we are going to apply this to a case study. So this case study is called Bob's Bird Cages, and I have got some inputs for you, and we're going to calculate those. We're going to put it together. Just going back to my Excel, and we've got something set up here for you already. So we've got some fixed costs of $250,000. We've got some variable costs here. So all of our variable costs add up to $40. Our selling price is $125. And what we want to know, what we really don't know, the variable, the thing that we don't know in this model is the number of cages that we're going to produce. So we've got these beautiful bird cages and we don't know what the demand is going to be. So we've set up our really simple model here. So our revenue is calculated based on the number of cages. The variable cost is also our $40 is also based on 5,000, which gives us our total cost, and our profit there is 174. So just going back to our goal seek, of course, we could see what our break even is. So we could use a goal seek just for a bit of fun. We could run a goal seek and we could say, if I set that cell there, set my profitability to 0 by changing the number of cages, you could work backwards and see that my break-even point is 2944. That's not what we are here to do. What we want to know is based on our normal distribution, if we were to have a mean of 5,000 and a standard deviation of 1,500, what I'd like to know is what is our simulation. So what Monte Carlo basically does is it runs through thousands and thousands or hundreds and thousands of different iterations in Excel. So to do that, I'm going to use the RAND formula. I'm sure you've used that one before. The RAND, actually if I pop it over here, just to show you, if I use a RAND open bracket, close bracket, that is going to come up with a random number between 0 and 1. So every time I hit F9, it's going to change that. So that comes up with a random number, and that's we're going to force that to run multiple iterations of my calculation. So I'm going to use a norm.imv formula, that one there. So that formula is going to come up based on the mean and the standard deviation and the probability that I give it. Actually, I might just pop up our this dialog box. So the probability is going to be a RAND formula. So I'm going to say RAND open bracket, close bracket. The mean is going to be 5,000 and the standard deviation is going to be the 1,500. So that is up, in this case, 444. So it's going to look something like that. So it's a norm.imv. The probability is a random number between 0 and 1. The mean is 5,000 and the standard deviation is 1,500. So if I were to hit F9, so F9 will give it a new calculation. It comes up with a different number. Hit F9 again, it comes up with a different number. So every time I recalculate this workbook, it comes up with an entirely different number. And that is based on the normal distribution. So if I were to run that through my simulation again, so if I just copy my formulas across, you can see there that that's actually based on my new, the new output. That's my simulation. It's all run on my simulation. So you can see there, that's $265,000 profit. Let's hit F9. It's changing. So we can use this. Every time I hit F9, it gives me, oh, there we go. It's given me a loss. So it's what I want to know. The question, of course, remember that a financial model always has to answer a question. The question that I want to know is, what is the probability of my model giving me a loss? So in this case, it's giving me a loss, but it's not very likely. So every time I hit F9, it gives me a different number. Gave me a loss just then. So it's not very often. So what I want to do now is to run that. I want to run that through 1,000 iterations, and I'm going to do this using a data table. So it's it's an unusual way of using a data table. But again, if I link that through to there, and then if I just Control Shift down right to the bottom. So I've set that up for 1,000 iterations. And if I run a data table, I am just going to get it to just iterate 1,000 times. So it doesn't actually matter what you put. Unlike the data table that we did earlier, it really doesn't matter what the input is. So I'll say, okay, there we go. And so that has run down 1,000 times, and it's basically equal to me hitting F9 1,000 times. And of course, I always like to look at things visually. So if I Shift Control down and insert, if I were to create a chart, look at that. So interesting. That is what my data looks like, so basically you can see that it's kind of sitting around about, I think it was about 160,000 for my profitability. But what would be more interesting would be if I were to change chart type and change that to a histogram. There we go. And of course, change the colors, so make it look a little more interesting. I probably don't need those. That doesn't really mean very much. I can get rid of that, and I can probably get rid of that as well. So that's just a bit of a visual, and I can cut that and move it up to the top. There we go. So you can see that it does basically follow a normal distribution pattern. So if I hit F9 again, it changes a little bit. Okay, so every time I hit F9, it's going to change a little bit. So that's kind of interesting. But what I want to do here now is to use a count if formula to work out how many times does it turn a profit and how many times does it turn a loss. So I'm going to use a count if formula to do that. So my range is all the way down here, F4, and profitability or profit means that it's going to be greater than 0. Say, okay, there we go. And I can do exactly the same thing here, except this time it's going to be less than 0. There we go. So the total is 1,000, and I can do a percentage there, and I can do the same with that one there. So that will give me a percentage of 100. So every time I hit the F9, there we go. So you can see it doesn't vary very much. So the profitability, I can say with a fair degree of confidence that there is a 91, 92% probability that we are going to make a profit. So the question that we want answered is, how likely is it that we're going to make a profit? And we think it's pretty likely based on the output of this model. So remember that Excel is the most fantastic tool. There are so many different tools and features that you can use in Excel. So that is just a really, really quick summary of the 5 different tools that you can use within standard Excel for running scenario or sensitivity analysis over the top of your financial model. So my name is Danielle Stein Fairhurst. Please stay in touch. Subscribe to my channel. I'd love to hear from you, and I will hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.